On the afternoon of August 2nd, 1998, a 48-year-old 6-foot 6-inch tall hiker named Mike Turner stopped for a moment and took his bottle out of his backpack and took a sip. Mike was standing in a cluster of trees on the side of this mountain about 11,000 feet up, inside of an area in Wyoming called the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. The Fitzpatrick Wilderness is easily one of the most visually striking places in the entire world. It's like all of the extremes of nature kind of collided together in this one place. You have these massive, 13,000 foot tall snow-covered mountain peaks, you have glaciers, and then right below them, right at the base of these huge mountains, are all these lush green fields full of tall grass and flowers and animals running around and little streams and lakes. I mean, it's absolutely picturesque. In fact, some of the pictures of this area, they look fake. They're so ridiculous. But the real reason the Fitzpatrick Wilderness was known as this unbelievably beautiful place was because really it went kind of untouched by people because it was so hard to get to. I mean, basically the only people who stepped foot in this very surreal landscape were really experienced outdoors people like Mike Turner, because it took a lot of know-how just to get to this area and to survive in this area. This is a very, very rugged place. But Mike Turner was not content just going to the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. He really wanted to experience the true nature of this area. And so what he was doing while he was out there was hiking off trail. And so he's in this totally remote place, hiking around in an area that was not even marked on a map. Now, to anybody who has not done any compass and map navigating out in the wild, this might seem totally reckless. And to a degree, it sort of is. But it's something that people totally have a knack for. I can speak from my own experience. When I was in the military, we did a lot of compass and map navigating, like in the backcountry in Alaska and also in California. And I was terrible at it, but I can tell you some of my classmates definitely had sort of like an innate skill to understand where they were in relationship to terrain features. And then if you combine that with proper training and experience, I mean, these guys got really good at just being able to navigate with a map and compass. And so Mike was one of those people that really was an excellent navigator. And so walking off trail like this in such a remote place was sort of routine for him. Now, Mike was not some full-time adventurer. This was something he did that was sort of a passion for him. His job was he was a reverend at a Christian church in Idaho, and he had been for 10 years. And Mike loved being a reverend. He loved his congregation, and his wife Diane and his 3 kids, he had 2 daughters and a son, they were all super involved in the church. I mean, it was a great thing. But at the same time, being a reverend was a lot of work, a lot of responsibility, and a lot of stress. And a way that Mike had found to kind of cope with that growing stress of being a reverend was to go out hiking. He actually found, sort of ironically, that when he was out in nature hiking, he felt closer to God than when he was inside of his church preaching. And it was because he sort of looked at the world as this grand gift from God. And imagine being in the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, looking at this unbelievable terrain. I mean, it looks like, God made this. I mean, who else could? This is so strikingly beautiful. And so with that as context, on this particular day that Mike had stopped to sip water 11,000 feet up on this mountainside, this was actually the 4th day of a 9-day pre-planned solo hike through this wilderness that Mike had been planning out for over a year. Now, even though Mike was a very skilled hiker and backpacker and survivalist, he knew doing any sort of really long solo hike came with a whole bunch of risks that only really come if you're solo hiking. The biggest risk being that if you get into trouble when you're out on a solo hike, well, you're all alone. So you better have a really good plan for what you're going to do if you get into trouble. And so Mike had come up with a great plan. He had spent that whole year mapping out this off-trail path he was going to take over these 9 days. It was a 60-mile trip through the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, and he drew out basically exactly where he expected to go on a map, and he gave that map with all the different coordinates and exactly where he'd be on each day to his wife, who also was a very enthusiastic hiker. And he told her, on the 9th day, you're going to meet me at this spot at the end of the 60 miles at noon on this 9th day right here, and I will meet you there and you can take me home. However, that plan had changed on that 4th day as Mike was sipping his water on the mountainside. And only Mike knew it because he had no way to communicate back to his friends and family. Cell phones were very primitive at the time, so he couldn't just call somebody. I mean, basically, if he deviated his plan, he was the only one who would know. Now, the reason why Mike, on the 4th day of this 9-day trip, decided to alter his course made a lot of sense. So even though Mike was technically solo hiking, he was not actually alone. With him was the family dog named Andy, who was a very good-natured black lab mix who loved going hiking. And over the course of the previous day and then into this fourth day, he and Andy had been up at elevation at about 13,000 feet, walking on some icy parts of the mountain, and Andy's paws were getting really raw from kind of walking on the jagged ice. And that day, on the fourth day, Mike had noticed Andy was whimpering and struggling to keep up when normally Andy was super energetic and running all around. And he knew that, my course that I'm supposed to be going on for the next few days is going to be going all through these mountains with all this ice. And I don't think Andy can keep up. He's not going to be able to do it. And so he had decided to side skirt the mountains to avoid the ice. And even though this path was definitely going to take him a little bit longer, it would still bring him to the same destination, to that same pickup spot where his wife and his family would be waiting for him. Now, Mike understood that by deviating his route, not only would his family not know, like they would have no idea where he was, but also this secondary route he'd be taking to save Andy's paws was going to take a little bit longer than the intended course would take. And so he knew he was not going to be there at the time he said he would. So he was not going to be there at noon on the 9th day. It was going to be maybe the 10th day or beyond. But Mike had planned for this contingency. He had brought extra supplies specifically if he had to extend his journey. And so he felt confident that even though this was a big risk, to take this path that nobody knows he's on, he felt he could do it with no problems. And so after Mike finished taking a sip of his water, he pulled a bowl from his pack that was for Andy, and he poured some water in it, and he placed it on the ground, and Andy kind of made his way over and began lapping at the water. And as he did, Mike looked down and saw Andy's tail wagging happily. And Mike felt confident, seeing how much better his dog was already doing, that this was definitely the right decision. Taking this secondary route was definitely the way to go. But as Mike waited for his dog to finish drinking, Andy suddenly stopped and then lifted his head up with his ears perked up like he had sensed something. And then before Mike could stop him, Andy just took off running into the trees and disappeared. Now, Andy was a playful dog that periodically kind of ran around on the hikes like this. But remember, Mike is out in the backcountry and he's deviated his path. He needs to be really sure of where he is. He can't afford to make mistakes here. And if Andy just goes rogue and he has to go chase after him, the opportunity to get turned around or lost, or maybe come in contact with some big predator that maybe Andy has sensed, were pretty high. And so Mike grabbed the bowl and took off running into the trees after Andy. And after going into those trees, he emerged on the other side, Mike did, and suddenly he was hit with this incredible view, kind of looking down towards this lake, and there was this huge clearing on this side of the mountain that was filled with these huge boulders, like boulders the size of small cars, and they were everywhere. Basically, the mountain, as it eroded, chunks of rock were rolling down into this clearing that was sort of at a slant down towards this lake, and it just filled the entire clearing with boulders, to the point where you really couldn't actually walk on solid ground. The only way to get from where Mike was and where Andy was, because at this point he could see his dog was making his way towards the lake. Clearly, that's what Andy had sensed, the lake, and he was going to get a drink or something. And so Mike knew to get to his dog, he would basically have to climb onto the boulders and jump from rock to rock all the way to his dog. And so Mike tried calling for Andy one more time to stop and come back, but Andy was on his own program going towards the lake. And so, resigned to the situation, Mike climbed on top of the first boulder and began jumping boulder to boulder in the direction of his dog. 1 week later, on the afternoon of August 9th, Mike's wife, Diane, along with her 3 kids and some family friends, stood at the start of a trail called the Big Sandy Trail, which was the designated meeting spot where Mike said he would meet his family at the end of this 9-day journey. And as Diane stood there at this meeting place, she kept anxiously checking her watch. Mike was late, and not just a few minutes late. He was a full 24 hours late. Mike was supposed to be there on the 8th at noon, and now it's the 9th, and he's still not here. But remember, Mike is a guy that did stuff like this fairly regularly. He was very competent out in the wild, and everybody knew when he went off on this journey that, of course, there was some variability to when he would actually arrive at the meeting place. Despite Mike saying, "I'll be there on the 8th at noon," Diane and her friends and family all sort of felt like, well, I hope he's there at noon, but realistically, he might be, several hours or maybe even a day late, and that's okay. And so the day before, when he didn't show up at noon, people were anxious, but they were okay. Now, 24 hours later, and still Mike has not shown up, there's no trace of him, Diane and her kids and the family friends, they were starting to worry. And in fact, before Mike left on this trip, he told Diane that if for some reason he does not show up on the 9th, so 24 hours after he said he would be there, and it's past 4 o'clock on the 9th, this is the trigger point, that Diane should call the authorities and assume something is wrong and send out a search party. And so Diane is checking her watch on the 9th, and soon enough, it's 4 p.m., Mike's not here, 4:05, 4:10, 4:15, still no Mike. And even though she knew her husband said, now it's time, go get the authorities, she just couldn't bring herself to do it. She felt like it's such a huge to-do if you get a search party organized out here. I mean, that's a massive effort, super expensive. And she felt like the second she told authorities that like Mike would come walking out of the wilderness with a big story to tell and a big apology for being late. And so she convinced herself that, you know what, give him one more day, I'm sure he's bound to show up. But the next day, on the 10th, when still there was no sign of Mike, that morning, Diane did go to the authorities and she reported Mike missing. And just as she expected, a massive search was launched for Mike. But you need to keep in mind here that again, Diane and the searchers and everybody besides Mike has no idea that he has altered the path he was on. And they're going to be searching this massive expanse of wilderness that even with the best of conditions, knowing exactly where someone is on their route, I mean, it's so hard to find people out here. I mean, it's totally rugged. Things are obscured from view, from the air, from the land. There are areas you can't even get to. There's predators out there. I mean, this is a dangerous thing to be doing. And again, they don't know he's not even on that path anymore. He's deviated. And so, despite helicopters in the air, horseback teams out in force, hundreds of volunteers combing the area looking for Mike, nobody found a trace of him. And after 2 weeks went by with this huge search producing nothing, they finally had to call it off. And so, of course, Mike's family is just unbelievably devastated. They have no idea what's happened to Mike. Have you ever thought to yourself, man, I just wish I could consume the strange, dark, and mysterious in live storytelling format? Well, guess what? That is now a reality. Because I am going on tour. I'm going to go to 15 different cities around the country and stand on a stage and tell some wild stories to anybody who wants to join. And these will be a combination of old school classic, MrBallen's strange, dark, and mysterious stories, and some new ones that have not been published on any of our platforms. So some new stuff you can only get if you come see me live. But you gotta act fast because we just announced this tour last week and already tickets are being bought at a record speed here. So if you want tickets, you gotta act now. All you have to do is go to tour.ballenstudios.com or click the link in the description below. In terms of the types of tickets you can buy, there are general seating tickets, and there's also the VIP package if you want to meet this guy, okay? So that's over here. And for our VIP ticket holders, bring your graphic novel with you if you bought it on pre-sale, or you can actually buy a copy of the book at the venue, and I will sign the book during our meet and greet. So that's just for the VIP people. Bring your graphic novel, or you'll have a chance to buy the graphic novel at the venue, and I will sign it for you when we finally get to meet. So again, go to tour.ballenstudios.com and get your tickets now. I will see you there. Five days later, so 5 days after the end of the official search, we're now at August 28th at this point. A couple of backpackers were hiking through an area in the Fitzpatrick Wilderness that was actually about 17 miles away from the last known sighting of Mike Turner. Now, that was not when he went through the trees and saw the boulders. This was around the time Mike literally began the 9-day epic journey. Somebody had seen him in one area, and so where these two backpackers are is about 17 miles away from there. And so these two backpackers, they were aware that Mike Turner was missing because there were flyers up all over the place around the outside of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness at the beginning of all the trailheads and in town and all over the place. So they were aware of this, aware that Mike was missing and his dog was missing. And as they're just sitting there taking a break, this totally emaciated, ragged-looking black lab came out of the tree line, whimpering and looking like it was on its last legs. It was Andy. And right away, these backpackers knew that's the missing dog. And so they lured the dog to them with granola bars, and Andy came up and he ate, they gave him water. And just so you know, Andy would survive and make a full recovery. And so after these backpackers have Andy in their possession, they immediately contacted authorities, who then got in touch with Mike's family and said, hey, we found Andy. And so you can imagine the absolute roller coaster of emotion Mike Turner's family is going through. Now that they hear Andy is okay, Andy's come out of the forest, they're thinking, oh my goodness, maybe Mike is okay too. Maybe Andy can lead us back to where Mike is. Mike is this totally skilled survivalist. He's got to be alive out there. And so after discovering Andy, a second search was launched, using Andy as the guide dog. They basically went to that spot where the backpackers found him, and basically Andy's family and some other volunteers allowed Andy to lead them back into the wilderness, hoping it would lead them to Mike. And so as this new search began, with Andy leading the way, a separate backpacker, who we will call Brian, just for the sake of the story, that's not his name, but we're gonna call him Brian, he was hiking through a section of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, not near where Andy was. This is a separate area. And Brian, he was not involved in looking for Mike Turner, but he was aware that Mike was missing because, again, he had seen all the missing person flyers, he'd seen the news, and when he began his own hike into the wilderness, he had seen at the start of his own trailhead a big flyer with a picture of Mike Turner and his dog saying he was missing. So Brian's aware of Mike Turner's absence, but he's just going on his own hike into the wilderness. And after a few days of solo hiking his way into this totally rugged expanse, he eventually reaches this kind of dense cluster of trees about 11,000 feet up on the side of a mountain, and he walks through those trees, and when he emerges on the other side, out in front of him, sloping down to a lake, is this unbelievable boulder field that practically takes his breath away. But that was not the thing that really got his attention. Instead, as he's taking in these boulders and this unbelievable view of the mountains in the distance and this lake, he noticed there was a man sitting on a rock fairly far across this boulder field with his back to Brian, just staring at the lake. Now, remember, this is like the middle of nowhere, and Brian certainly was not expecting to come across any other person on this journey. And so naturally he thought, okay, I need to go up and make sure this guy is okay, or if nothing else, I want to talk to him. I mean, this is a very rare thing to come in contact with other people out here. And so Brian began walking towards this guy to see what was going on. Well, that man was the missing hiker, Mike Turner. And my goodness, did Mike Turner have a story to tell. But to understand Mike's story, we need to go back 29 days to the point when Andy the dog had taken off running from Mike and he had gone into the boulder field, and Mike had emerged through those trees and seen the boulders, he's seen his dog, and he began climbing onto that first rock to begin making his way towards his dog. So Mike, he gets up on that rock and he begins hopping from boulder to boulder to boulder. And at first it's going fine. He gets about halfway across the boulder field. He's, yelling to Andy to stay put, and he's kind of making his way. It's all good. But then he reaches this one particularly large boulder that when he jumped onto it, it was kind of unstable and it began to wobble under his feet. And so instinctively, Mike tried to leap off of the wobbly boulder onto another boulder that was right nearby. But when he jumped, he sort of undershot this second boulder and so did not land on it and stay put on it. Instead, he kind of hit the face of this second boulder and slipped down to the ground. Didn't hurt Mike, he's just now on the ground in this small space between the boulders. However, unfortunately, the wobbly boulder right behind Mike, well, it didn't just continue to wobble, it wobbled to the point where it rolled forward and literally came to a rest against the second boulder that Mike had just jumped onto and failed to land on top of. Basically, wobbly boulder impacted second boulder, sandwiching Mike between them. But critically, it did not harm Mike. This is going to take some explaining, but it'll make sense after I go through it. Wobbly boulder had what looked like almost a U-shaped cutout on the face of the wobbly boulder. Like imagine a perfectly round boulder, but there's like a divot kind of sitting on the front of it. And it just so happened that on the second boulder in front of wobbly boulder, it also had a sort of divot on the face of it, kind of looking like a U-shape. And when these two boulders collided, these 800-pound boulders, Mike happened to be standing exactly in the position where those two cutouts wrapped around him like shackles. They basically pinned his ankles together, where he could not pull his legs up and out of this totally tight space that was just big enough to hold his legs in place. It was like he was anchored to the ground. But again, Mike is unharmed. His legs aren't broken, he's not battered, nothing. He just cannot move. Now, Mike instantly would have known this is a really big issue because he can't move these 800-pound boulders. They are 800 pounds. And he's by himself, minus his dog, who can't really help him with the boulders. And so Mike immediately just jumps into, oh my goodness, I have to find a way to somehow just move these boulders. Even just a millimeter, a centimeter would be enough to free his feet. And so he pulled off his bag, and one by one, he pulled out every piece of equipment he had, including his camera tripod and his stove and whatever he had. And he did everything he could to try to pry these stupid boulders off of him, but they would not budge. And so after 2 hours of trying in vain to free himself, it dawned on Michael that he was not going to be able to free himself. The only way he was getting out of here is if somebody found him and rescued him. And so Mike, doing his best to stay calm, he pulled out his journal he had brought along for this trip in order to detail, his closeness with God and, what he was learning throughout this journey. And he began documenting what happened to him, to include, why he was in this boulder field, what he was doing when he got stuck, how he wound up in these sort of granite shackles, so to speak. He also very clearly in his writing was very much putting his faith in God to get him out of here. He wrote in his journal on this first day, 2 hours into this predicament, I am in your hands, Lord. I don't know what I may face. The idea being, I don't know what's going to happen to me, but my faith is in you. I know you will help me through this. And so after writing this initial entry, Mike turned his attention to survival. Like not trying to push the boulders off, but trying to survive amidst the boulders as long as possible. And so he pulled out his blue sleeping bag and kind of wrapped it around himself to insulate himself. He got out his stove, and there was some snow in reach, and he began putting snow in his stove and melting it to create water. And he also pulled his tent flap over the top of him. I mean, he was basically setting up camp inside of these boulders. And that first night must have been absolutely horrifying. I mean, the temperatures dropped down to near freezing, even though during the day it was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But that night he's in this horrible position, just trapped with his own thoughts, just hoping and praying that, God was going to get him out of here. The next day when Mike woke up, he wrote in his journal some more, and he began detailing his biggest fears. One of them was potentially having to have his legs amputated if he got out of here. The damage of losing circulation to his legs was scary. He wrote that he had food for at least a week, but he only had 2 quarts of water, and there wasn't all that much snow around him left to melt, and he was running out of fuel, and so he was really worried about not having enough water, even though, very ironically, he was like 25, 30 feet away from a lake, which he could have drank water from, but again, he's trapped to the ground. And so on the second day, Mike actually attempted to throw his water bottle, which he connected some rope to try to get it into the lake, to capture some water and pull it back to him. But when he threw it, it was just short of the water. He could not get it into the water, so he couldn't scoop any water into his bottle. And then when he tried to retrieve the bottle, as the bottle was being dragged towards him, it got wedged in some rocks. And again, he can't move, so he can't possibly fling it out of these rocks. And so he couldn't even get his water bottle back. And so by the end of that second day, Mike's tone in his journal began to change. It wasn't totally negative yet, but he began talking about how, man, I wonder what's going to happen when I run out of water. I wonder what my urine will taste like if I mix it with Crystal Light. So it was kind of like he was joking about the fact that he was going to try to make his pee taste better, but it also showed he was beginning to realize just how serious this situation was. Nobody knows where he is. He's completely off the beaten path. He has no idea if anybody even knows he's in trouble, and he's about to be out of water. The next day, so the third day of being trapped inside of these boulders, Mike would once again begin writing in his journal. And his tone seemed a bit more optimistic, despite the fact that he has not solved, this water crisis he's about to face. He's down to his literal last quart of water. But in his journal, he talked about how this whole trip he went on, this 9-day trip he had planned out, the whole point was to become closer to God. And he felt like, I've really done that in the past couple of days. What I wanted to achieve, having a really spiritual event here, it's happened like times 100 being trapped here. I mean, this is the closest I've ever felt to God. But you could just tell there was just an underlying sense that I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to learn from this experience. I'm not going to take stupid risks anymore. I'm going to be a better father, be a better husband, be a better reverend. I'm going to make something of myself. I'm going to improve as a result of this suffering I'm going through right now. However, over the next few days that Mike continued to be trapped in these rocks with no help coming, his optimism clearly waned. He began to write that he was angry with God. He wondered, is this a punishment for something I've done? And he also thought, maybe I failed God, and that's why I'm here. but it was just clear that Mike, who was this deeply spiritual person who absolutely believed in a higher power, how could he be in this terrible position and not be getting any sort of help from God? How could that be? But unfortunately for Mike, his situation only got worse. On about day 5 or 6, as Mike was laying wretchedly inside of this horrible camp he had built, he noticed that he had completely lost feeling in his left leg. Like completely. It was a dead leg at this point. And even though he knew by this point how bad of a situation he was in, this sparked a new, very real fear inside of Mike that he detailed in his journal. He knew his body was actually beginning to break down, and still there is no help, no divine help coming in despite all his prayers. There's no one coming to rescue him. He is all alone. In fact, Mike would write in his journal something that practically brought me to tears when I read it first, and it just said, "So lonely, more than I imagined." I just can't picture what it would be like to be trapped out there. You're not hurt, but you can't go anywhere, and you're all alone, just slowly withering away. And your family, they're somewhere out there, they have no idea, nobody knows. It's just unbelievably devastating. The mental torture this man went through is just out of this world. But it just keeps getting worse. Day 6, day 7, Mike at some point actually dropped his journal, and because he can't actually reach it anymore, he just picked up whatever objects he had and continued writing on them, like his pocket Bible, and then also there was an instruction manual for his stove, and he would write in the margins, and his writing just continued to get more and more pessimistic and sad. He began writing about how intensely he regretted his decision to take the long route. He was totally setting him up for this situation. Nobody would have known where he is. And so he's hating on himself. He's still mad at God. Why aren't you here? Aren't you seeing how badly I'm suffering? I mean, this is a guy who's basically losing his mind with regret and anguish and just pure loneliness. I mean, this is horrible. But then on the 7th and 8th day or 9th day that he was stuck in these boulders, once again, Mike's writing on his random things that he wrote on took another turn. Not only was his writing becoming more and more illegible, because he's literally dying here. I mean, his body's breaking down. He's exposed to the sun all day, and then at night it's freezing cold. He's not having any water. He's drinking his urine. He's got no food left. He can barely write. His writing begins to talk about his family and his children. At this point, Mike must have known the end is near. And so all he had was just the thoughts of his family. He began wondering, what his kid's life were going to be like in the future, because obviously the implication here is he knows he won't be there to see it. He'll be dead. And then in some of the last entries he would make, it was obvious that really Mike had turned back to God. Now he was back to approaching God with open arms. He was no longer upset or questioning God's plan. He was just ready. He actually wrote in his journal, "Fill me with peace, Lord. May my conditions not deny my love for you." And then he wrote, "I'm ready to die, though I'm missing my family." And then in his final entry, which must have been on the 10th day of his predicament, Mike's writing was basically completely illegible at this point because he's right on death's door. And even though you can't really tell what he wrote, at the end of this final entry, it says, "Love, Dad." It was like he was saying his final goodbye to his family. Then Mike took off his wedding band and he placed it on the rock next to him because he knew once he died and decomposed, the ring would fall off his bones and be lost in the rocks below. And he clearly wanted his family to have that wedding ring, so he placed it on the rock and then he prepared to die. When Brian the hiker walked up to the sitting man he saw on this boulder, he realized almost immediately that that was Mike Turner because he had seen the missing person flyers before he came into the wilderness. And so knowing this is the guy they're looking for and knowing he couldn't move him, he covered him up and then he took Mike Turner's wallet, which contained his ID, and then as fast as he could, Brian the hiker made his way back to the beginning of the trailhead and contacted authorities. I will say it took Brian almost 3 days to contact authorities, and he was going as fast as he could, retracing his steps. So that really gives you a sense of really just how remote of an area Mike was in when he passed away. And then also, it would turn out that Andy the dog, who was leading that secondary search, he wouldn't find Mike before Brian would. But once they discovered where Mike had died and they checked the direction Andy was taking his family, it was obvious that Andy was heading in that direction. He was a faithful dog going back to save his owner. He just wasn't going to get there in time. And to close the story out, making it even more tragic, on the day that Mike left his wife Diane and his 3 beautiful children to begin this 9-day trek, after he left, Diane received a bouquet of flowers in the mail that Mike had sent that he knew would arrive after he had left. And attached to this bouquet was a note. And the note was written to Diane, and it just said, "Thank you for letting me live this adventure. Know that wherever I am and whatever I'm doing, I'm thinking of you." On the afternoon of October 16th, 1991, a 36-year-old man named Enrique Martinez bent down, pulled out his pocket knife, and he carefully cut through the stem of a mushroom that was growing right next to a mossy log. And then after freeing this mushroom, he put it inside of his wicker basket with the other mushrooms he had collected in the area. And then Enrique stood up and just took a minute to take in the unbelievable view of this lush green valley right below him. Enrique was out mushroom hunting along with his wife Anna and their two friends Jorge and Sofia, who were dating. And where they were mushroom hunting was near this old abandoned town called La Musara, which is located up in the mountains of northeastern Spain. It had been Jorge's idea to come to this area and explore. Jorge had heard all these crazy stories about La Musara, about how it was haunted, and there was all this creepy folklore surrounding this town. As for Enrique, he didn't really care about the lore surrounding this town. Frankly, the town was not that interesting to him. What was interesting was the opportunity to come out here and collect mushrooms. That was something he really liked to do. Enrique and his wife Anna lived in this very busy port city in Spain called Tarragona, and so their lives day to day were very hectic. Enrique, he worked at a bar as a bartender, and so every night he was surrounded by hundreds of people coming in and out. And so having a chance to come out here and be in nature at peace and collect these mushrooms just sounded too good to turn up. Enrique stopped staring at the valley right in front of him, and he turned around and continued to scan the mountainside for a particular type of mushroom that grew in this area. It was called the bloody milk cap, which was known to be great for grilling. It paired well with meat. And so Enrique's plan was to go out on this mushroom hunting trip, and when they got back, he wanted to cook a feast using these mushrooms for his wife and his friends. The group slowly made their way uphill until they finally saw the outskirts of the abandoned town, La Musara. La Musara was more than 900 years old, and now it was just a collection of crumbling ruins, some dating back to prehistoric times. La Musara had never been a big town. At its peak, it had about 300 residents. But the last of the remaining residents of this town had finally fled 40 years earlier, and so now it was a ghost town. The group made their way over to one of the buildings that was right on the outer perimeter of La Musara. It was basically just a foundation with 3 walls still standing. There was no roof, but the friends, they went over to this building, and from right next to it, they were able to look straight down the main drag of La Musara. It was basically just a dirt road that went straight out, and all along the road were other kind of ruined foundations of where buildings used to be. And fairly far down this road, maybe 200 feet away from where all the friends were standing, was the center of La Musara, which was marked by this big church with a huge steeple, and the church was actually in decent shape. It had not totally crumbled onto itself like the rest of the buildings around it. And then behind the church, somewhat visible from where the friends were standing, was this overgrown cemetery. And then kind of off to the side of the church was this pond that was also very overgrown, and it was full of croaking frogs. Enrique and his friends just stood there next to their dilapidated building, staring at La Musara in silence. Now, they knew this place was going to be very creepy. People had said it was haunted, and that was a big reason why Jorge wanted to come here. But now seeing it in person, really the creep factor was much higher than they expected. It really did look like a spooky place. And then adding to the spook factor was very clearly, as they were looking down this main road, the friends could see this mist kind of starting to envelop the town. Jorge had told the friends when he was doing his research about La Musara that the mist was really a trademark of this town, that at night it basically got completely consumed in white mist. But now the friends are looking down this road, it's the middle of the day, and already the mist is starting to come in. Finally, Jorge broke the silence and said, "Hey, I want to show you guys something." And he grabbed his girlfriend Sofia's hand, and he began kind of jogging down the main road in the direction of the church. And so Enrique and Anna followed behind. And after only walking maybe 10 or 20 feet, Enrique happened to turn around and look back where they had just been standing next to this dilapidated building, and already he couldn't see that building because this fog had rolled in and totally obscured his view. Enrique couldn't help but feel a little uneasy, again, because he thought the fog was supposed to come in at night, and it's broad daylight, and here we are, totally covered in fog, but he shook it off, thinking, what's the big deal? And so Enrique turned back around, and he and Anna hustled to catch up with Jorge and Sofia, who by this point had stopped a little farther down the road, off to the side, where there was this strange rectangular rock that was maybe 2 feet tall, just kind of jutting up out of the ground. And when Enrique and Anna made it to Jorge and Sofia, Jorge placed his hand on the top of this strange rock, and looking very satisfied with himself, he would tell his friends, this is the Sis Stone, and people say it contains dark powers. The Sis Stone was actually one of the oldest things in all of La Musara. Back in the day, Muslim armies used to march through La Musara, which actually got its name from this. La Musara means the place to march. And so these armies, as they would pass through La Musara, making their way to the valley down below, they would always stop at the Sis Stone because they believed it had magical powers that could help them defeat their enemies in their upcoming battles. Now, the Muslim armies were long gone by this point, but the Sis Stone was still there, and people still said that it contained that kind of magical power, that there were dark forces at work inside of the stone, and so to touch it was very risky. In fact, some people said if you touch the Sis Stone, you could be sucked into this parallel world full of all these demonic entities. And so as Jorge told the group about all this history surrounding the Sis Stone and how no one should touch it, remember, he's got his hands squarely on the Sis Stone the whole time. And so when he finishes telling this story, he looks at the others and said, come on, somebody else touch it. Jorge's girlfriend, Sofia, said, absolutely not. I'm not about to tempt evil spirits here. But Enrique's wife, Anna, said, you know what? I'll touch it. And so Jorge smiled, he pulled his hand off the Sis Stone, and Anna, she walked forward, she took a deep breath, and then she placed her hand on the stone. And for a second, the whole group just held their breath, like something was going to reach out and grab Anna and pull her into the stone, but nothing happened, and a minute later, Anna had pulled her hand off, and the whole group was laughing. But just a couple of seconds later, Enrique, who had been laughing along with the group, suddenly noticed that the frogs in the pond near the church, a little farther down the road from where they were suddenly so much louder. It was almost like when they touched the stone, it had maximized the volume of these frogs. And so Enrique, he turned his whole body and began staring down the road through the mist and fog at this pond, and he could kind of barely make it out. You know, he was trying to see if there was something obvious causing these frogs to kind of go crazy. But as he stared at this pond, which again he could barely see, right behind it was the church. But there was lots of fog kind of blocking the church, and for a second the fog kind of parted, and Enrique got a full shot of one of the windows of this abandoned church. And in the window was this dark figure just standing there staring at Enrique and his friends. And Enrique, he sees this thing in the window, and in a second it was gone. And then the fog rolled back in, covered up the window, and Enrique couldn't see anything anymore. And so Enrique just stood there in stunned silence, having no idea if what he just saw had really just happened or if it was in his imagination or something. But before he could even try to process what had just happened, he heard his name being called. And so he kind of snapped out of it, and he turned back to the group, and it was Anna, who was now jokingly saying, come on, Enrique, touch the stone too. Enrique quickly scanned Anna, Sofia, and Jorge's face, and they were all smiling and laughing still, and so clearly none of them had seen this figure in the window. And so Enrique, he kind of just looked at all of his friends, and then he looked back in the direction of the church and this window, which again he couldn't see because the fog was blocking it out. And so Enrique just tells himself, okay, there's no way that I just saw some dark figure moving around this abandoned church. You know, that must have been my imagination. I'm totally fine. And so he turned back to his friends, and he could tell they were not going to let it go until he touched this stone. And so he said, fine, and he walked up and he touched the stone. And immediately, as soon as his hand made contact with that stone, everything seemed to change. The air around Enrique got cooler, and the stone itself started to warm up. And as this happened, Enrique, whose hand was still on the stone, began to think, wow, I could do this for hours. I could just stay here and leave my hand on the stone. I mean, this is amazing. But then somewhere buried deep in his mind, Enrique began telling himself, get away from the stone. Take your hand away, get away right now. And so finally, Enrique did yank his hand away, and right away, all those feelings he was having as he touched the stone disappeared. The air went back to normal. He did not feel compelled to touch the stone, and he just kind of was left thinking, what just happened? And so Enrique's wife, Anna, along with Jorge, they were both grinning at Enrique, waiting for him to tell them about what it was like to touch the cyst stone. But behind them, Sophia, Jorge's girlfriend, she was not happy. She was the only one who had not touched the cyst stone. And so she spoke up and said, guys, let's get away from the cyst stone. I don't want to continue to tempt evil spirits, okay? Let's just go. And so Jorge threw his arm around Sophia and told her to lighten up, and then said, come on, let's do some more exploring. And so Jorge took Sophia's hand and he continued walking down the main road in the direction of the church. And Enrique's wife, Anna, she quickly followed right after them, kind of running to keep up, like she was a kid who was excited about what they were doing. But Enrique, he just stayed put for an extra second, because even though he had told himself that, whatever he saw in the window was nothing, he could not help the fact that as soon as he touched that cyst stone, he felt different. There was something off about the stone, and really there seemed to be something off about this whole village, which by this point was now completely enveloped in fog. They were totally covered. Now, Enrique at this point did just want to leave La Musara. He didn't want to be there anymore. The place was totally creeping him out. But he didn't want to be a party pooper, and so he turned and continued walking down the main road after his friends and his wife. And after he walked a little ways, the fog parted enough that he could see the pond full of these very loud croaking frogs, as well as the church and that window where he had seen or supposedly seen this dark figure, but the window was empty. And Enrique was relieved to see that his friends clearly had not stopped at the church. They had not tried to go in. They had gone behind the church into the cemetery. Enrique did not want to go inside of the church because even though, again, he had told himself that, that figure wasn't real, it wasn't really in the window, still there was a part of him that wanted to stay far away from this building. But after Enrique walked past the pond and began side-skirting the church to get to the cemetery, he just stopped and turned and actually faced the window, kind of like involuntarily. He was looking at the window where this dark figure had been. And again, it's empty, there's nothing there, but Enrique felt like something was pulling him towards this window. And so without saying anything to his friends, who aren't really paying attention to Enrique, they're kind of just walking around the cemetery, Enrique walked right up to this window. He's right in front of it, he's looking inside, and now he can see into the actual church. And it's totally ruined inside, but he can see where the pews used to be on the ground, and he could also see where the pulpit used to be, where the priest would give mass. And as Enrique stood there staring into the church, he kept leaning closer and closer and closer into the church until finally he felt like he really wanted to move away and get away from the church, but it was like he couldn't. He just kept getting pulled into this opening. And then as this was happening, the sound of the frogs got louder and louder until Enrique felt like he was totally consumed by these frogs. Meanwhile, just around the corner of the church and back in the cemetery, Anna, Jorge, and Sophia were kind of laughing and walking around the cemetery, reading the different headstones, when at some point, Anna, Enrique's wife, just happened to look up when she realized Enrique was not there with them. And so Anna, she walked over to the gate of the cemetery and she looked up along the side of the church, and there was Enrique kind of leaning forward into this window looking into the church. And so Anna, she yelled out to him a couple of times, but Enrique did not even notice her or acknowledge her. He just continued leaning forward looking in this window. And finally, Anna got right up next to Enrique and she actually shook his shoulder. And when she did that, Enrique kind of snapped out of it and turned and looked at her, but didn't say anything. He just had this totally confused look on his face. And Anna, she looks up at her husband and she's like, come on, come into the cemetery. That's where everyone is, come on. And then Anna turned and skipped towards the cemetery. And once Anna was back in the cemetery, she just got right back to walking around and looking at all the different headstones. And at some point, as she was looking at one particular headstone, she took a few steps back to get a better look at it, and she accidentally bumped into another headstone, a big cross that had a line drawn across it, and it fell to the ground and it broke. Jorge and Sophia heard the sound of this stone breaking in half, and they turned and looked at Anna, and they kind of quickly understood what had happened. And Jorge, he just started laughing at her, and he said, oh boy, now you've upset the evil spirits in this town. You better put that back together. Now, Anna was trying to make light of this, but she was totally panicking and did not like the fact that she had just desecrated a gravesite in a potentially haunted town. And so she began picking up the headstone and trying to put the stone back on top, but it was no use. It was totally broken. And so as Anna continued to fumble with this headstone, and as Jorge continued to laugh and harass her about all the evil spirits that were going to attack her because of what she did, Jorge's girlfriend, Sophia, who was right next to him, she started getting on edge and she said, "Hey, Jorge, is it true that this place is haunted? I mean, really, is this actually a haunted town? I mean, what's the deal?" And Jorge, at this point, he stops laughing at Anna and he turns to Sophia and he goes, "Yeah, I think this place really is haunted." And then he would tell them the story of how La Musara came to be known as a haunted town. If you're enjoying today's story, well, I have exciting news for you. My long-awaited very first book is out right now. It's called MrBallen's Presents Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, The Graphic Stories, and it's shipping worldwide right now. This graphic novel was truly a labor of love, but I can tell you it came out just beautiful, and I think you're going to love it as much as we do. It has 4 feature-length, brand new stories, one of which you're listening to right now, along with 5 OG classic MrBallen's stories that have all been reformatted and re-edited to fit this book. If you want to purchase a copy of this bad boy, just go to book.ballenstudios.com, or you can go wherever books or audiobooks are sold. And speaking of audiobooks, if you enjoy hearing me tell you stories, well, guess what? There is an audiobook version of this. And I can tell you, when I recorded said audiobook, I got really into it and kind of, at times, went off script, kind of dramatically so. And so it winds up being this really cool accompanying piece to the graphic novel, but it's also a really unique standalone MrBallen piece. So it's like a really cool thing to get that is not just a regurgitation of what you read in the book. It's its own thing. Again, my first book, MrBallen's Presents Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, The Graphic Stories, is out right now and shipping worldwide. Go to book.ballenstudios.com or anywhere else books are sold to get your copy today. Back in October of 1873, there was a civil war happening in this part of Spain, and one of the rival armies was using the caves in the mountainside kind of near La Musara as sort of makeshift field hospitals for their wounded. And one night, a very famous general named Cercos was wounded in battle. He was brought into one of these caves, and that was where he died. Now, Cercos was a beloved leader, and so the people inside of this cave really wanted to give him a proper burial, but they knew they had to keep his death a secret, because if it got out to the rest of the men that their leader had died, it would be totally demoralizing and it would really give their enemies a victory. And so the 6 people inside of this cave, they built a coffin and placed Cercos inside of it, and then early the next morning, when it was still dark out, these 6 carried the coffin with Cercos inside of it up into La Musara, and they buried him secretly in the cemetery behind the church. Weeks later, 5 armed rival soldiers climbed up the mountain into La Musara to look for General Cercos. They didn't know that he had died in that battle. In fact, really, besides those 6 people that saw him die and secretly buried him, nobody knew he was dead. And so these soldiers actually thought Cercos was hiding out in La Musara. And so these soldiers began busting into all the civilians' homes in La Musara and ripping them apart looking for this general, and they'd send the people out into the streets and tell them they're going to kill them unless they give up information about where this general is. And finally, after about an hour of this, an elderly man who lived in La Musara had just had enough, and he stepped forward and he told the rival soldiers that General Cercos was dead, that he was buried in the cemetery behind their church. But the rival soldiers didn't believe the man. They said, "Okay, show us proof." But the elderly man said, "Well, I don't know exactly where he was buried in the cemetery. I just heard that's where he was buried." And so the soldier said, "Okay, get everybody over to the cemetery right now." And so all the townspeople made their way over to the cemetery, and the soldiers followed them. And then once they were there, the soldiers demanded that the townspeople begin basically digging up all the graves to find Cercos. And as the townspeople began to dig, the sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder and louder, until finally the leader of these rival soldiers actually stepped away from all the chaos happening in the cemetery and walked over to the pond and began firing his gun into the water to get the frogs to stop. But they wouldn't. They actually only got louder and louder. And so the leader of these rival soldiers finally just gives up on trying to quiet down these frogs, and he turns around and walks back into the cemetery, and he finds all the townspeople have stopped digging. They basically dug up every grave, and they haven't found Serkos, and they're just kind of waiting to see what happens next. But the leader, as he looked across this graveyard, he noticed there was one grave that very conspicuously had not been touched. Everything around it had been dug up, but not this. No one had touched that grave. And so the leader said, "Go, dig that one up." But immediately the townspeople kind of took a step back and acted like, "No way, we're not going near that grave." And so finally, a townsperson actually stepped forward and said to the leader of these rival soldiers that that grave contained this old woman who had died recently, who everyone suspected of being a witch. And so it was dangerous to try to dig her up. But the rival soldiers did not care at all about this. They just raised their guns and demanded the townspeople dig that grave up immediately. And so they would. They would go over, they would unearth this coffin, and then the rival soldiers would pop open the lid, and as soon as it was open, everybody went silent. Because this woman, who had died weeks earlier, looked totally preserved. She was laying on her back, and her skin was very pale, but it had not begun to rot yet. Even her cheeks still had a kind of pinkish hue to them, and her lips were open partway, as if she had been buried mid-sentence. But what really had startled the group into silence was this woman's eyes were wide open when they opened up this coffin. It looked like she was looking directly at all of them. And so after a couple of seconds of the silence from seeing this woman for the first time, the townspeople began to cry and scream and back up away from this coffin, and the rival soldiers, they were startled too by this woman's appearance, but they were more angry than anything else, because by finding this woman in this grave, it meant they had not found the general. And so out of frustration, the rival soldiers grabbed this old woman's body, this witch's body, and they pulled her out of her grave, they strung her up to a tree, and they just sat there shooting at her constantly until her body had basically been obliterated by all the bullets. And then finally, when the soldiers stopped shooting, they realized everything had gone quiet. Just a second earlier, the cacophony of these frogs croaking in the pond that had been so loud it was like totally overwhelming had now completely ceased, and it was like the town had gone absolutely still. And this stillness and quietness was so unsettling for these soldiers that they actually just turned and fled right there without saying a word to the townspeople. And then once the soldiers were all gone, the townspeople got to work reburying their dead. And at some point, one of the townspeople jumped into the grave where the witch had been, and when they landed in the dirt at the bottom, their foot actually sunk down an extra foot. They had landed on something hollow and crashed into it. And what it was another coffin. There was another coffin buried below this woman's that the soldiers had not seen. And this secret coffin belonged to General Serkos. When those 6 people had secretly buried General Serkos, they had just placed his coffin at the bottom of an open grave that was about to be filled with somebody else's coffin. They put it in, they covered up his coffin with enough dirt that no one could see it, and then the next day, the townspeople lowered the witch in her coffin into that grave without realizing General Serkos was below it, and then they filled it in, and then they placed a headstone on her grave, but because they thought she was a witch, they decided not to write her name on the headstone. Instead, they just etched a horizontal line across her headstone. And so after this incident with the rival soldiers desecrating this woman's grave and her body, La Musara was never the same. People in the town began dying left and right, and their soil went bad, so they couldn't plant any crops, and then all these insects came through the town, and then all these plagues of illnesses and diseases came through, and so it wasn't long before La Musara had developed this reputation of being cursed, and by the 1950s, that curse apparently had driven the last few people out, officially making it a ghost town. After Jorge wrapped up the story, Anna was just horrified looking straight down at the ground, because it would turn out the gravestone that she had accidentally knocked over and broken, well, it had a horizontal line etched across the middle of it. It was the witch's headstone. That was the one she had broken. And so suddenly feeling totally spooked, Anna was about to yell to Jorge and Sofia that she wants to leave now, when she happened to glance over at the base of one of the cemetery walls, and she saw the perfect bloody milk cap mushroom, the exact type she knew her husband was looking for. And so Anna walked over, she picked this mushroom, and she turned around to show it to Enrique, but Enrique was not in the cemetery. And so right away, Anna thought, wait, did my husband ever actually follow me back down into the cemetery after I saw him by the church? She couldn't remember. She thought he followed her, but she wasn't sure. And so Anna yelled out for Enrique, but he never called back. And so she turned and looked over at Sofia and Jorge, who she could barely see through the fog. And she asked them, hey, have you seen my husband? Is he in here? Did you see where he went? And they both said, no, we have no idea. And so Anna, who at this point was now really starting to panic because this whole situation in La Musara was getting pretty spooky for her. And so she just dropped the mushroom and took off running out of the cemetery. Now, Sofia and Jorge did not really know what was going on. They didn't understand the urgency that Anna was feeling to find Enrique. And so they saw her take off to go find Enrique, and they just kind of casually walked on after her. And when they turned the corner and they exited the cemetery and began walking basically alongside the church, now again, the visibility is terrible from all this fog. As they moved along, they couldn't see Anna or Enrique, but they could hear Anna calling out for Enrique over and over again. And as they moved, Sofia and Jorge, they would see these shadows moving around in the fog. And they would think it was Enrique or Anna, but as they got up to where these shadows were, there'd be nothing there. And so Sofia, she began grabbing tighter and tighter onto Jorge's arm, and Jorge, who had been kind of joking about how this place was evil, was also now starting to feel a little bit spooked about what was going on. And so they began walking a little bit faster and faster in the direction of Anna's voice. And as Sofia and Jorge got closer and closer to Anna, the sound of the frogs in that pond began to get louder and louder and louder until Jorge and Sofia could barely hear Anna over the sound of these frogs. And then just like that, the frogs stopped. And all Sofia and Jorge could hear was the sound now of Anna crying. Now, Jorge and Sofia could not actually see Anna because of the fog, but they walked in the direction of her voice, and they ultimately found Anna crouched down with her back to them right in the spot where Enrique had previously been standing staring in that church window. And so Sofia and Jorge, they walked up to Anna and they reached down and they put their hands on her shoulder. And when Anna turned around, she was clutching Enrique's wicker basket containing all of his mushrooms. And with tears coming down Anna's eyes, she would say to her friends, "He's gone." Anna, Jorge, and Sofia would spend the next hour searching in vain for Enrique in La Musara. Remember, there's no visibility from the fog, and now it's getting dark, and so it's really hard to conduct a search for someone. And so after this hour was up, even though they had no idea where Enrique was or what happened to him, the friends decided that their best and really only move was to leave and go tell authorities. And when they did that, a massive search was launched all around La Musara for the next week. But despite this huge effort, nobody ever found any trace of Enrique. He just vanished, leaving behind that wicker basket that Anna had found. And so after this week of searching, the authorities finally called it off and told Anna that, most likely her husband must have wandered off and died somewhere, and at some point, hikers will likely discover his body. But Anna could not accept this conclusion, and so she continued to go back to La Musara to look for Enrique. And in January of 1992, so 3 months after Enrique had gone missing, Anna, Sofia, and Jorge returned to La Musara to do another one of these additional searches. And during the search, the friends were walking past the church, and they passed by that same window where Enrique had been standing looking inside, and also where his basket had been found by Anna. And the three friends, as they passed by, they happened to see into the church, and down on the main floor where the pews used to be and where the pulpit used to be, there were these 6 dark figures wearing robes standing in a circle, not appearing to be doing anything but just standing there. And immediately, Anna actually was really annoyed because she figured this must be a group of ghost hunters that were out here looking for something paranormal, because after Enrique went missing, his story made the news largely because he went missing in a town that's long been regarded as being haunted. And so because of his case, you had all these people coming to La Musara to go find ghosts or find whatever happened to Enrique. And so Anna, who was deeply offended by all these people who were coming out to La Musara to look for ghosts, because for Anna, this is not a game. Her husband really went missing here. So she goes right up to the window to tell these 6 people in robes off, get the hell out of here and have some respect. But when she went to the window and was about to yell in, one of the robed figures suddenly turned and looked up at Anna. And immediately Anna backed up because this clearly was not some ghost hunter, because the hooded figure had no face. It was just a dark hole looking back up at Anna. But even though there were no eyes, Anna could tell this thing, this entity, was staring right at her. But before Anna, Sophia, or Jorge could react to what they were seeing inside of this church, from behind them, they suddenly heard this unbelievably loud galloping sound, like all these horses were charging towards them. And at the same time, the sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder and louder. And so Anna, Sophia, and Jorge turned around to see what was going on, kind of expecting to see, a cavalry approaching or something. But there was nothing. All they saw was the fog on the road. And so the three friends turned back around to look back into the church, and now these 6 hooded figures were gone. And so suddenly thinking that these figures had left the church and they were coming to get them, the 3 friends did not wait any longer. They turned and just sprinted out of La Musara. Enrique was never found. His wife, his friends, the authorities, they still have no idea what happened to him. There have also been several other people who have gone missing in La Musara, and they too have never been found. Just a reminder, my very first book, MrBallen's Presents Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, The Graphic Stories, is out right now and shipping worldwide. You can find it wherever books or audiobooks are sold. This book is truly a brand new experience for anybody who's a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious. We've never had a book before, so this is a big deal. It's a collection of 9 stories. Some are new, some are old, but they're all awesome. The artwork is incredible. The storytelling is just superb. So if you have not purchased your copy yet, or you haven't bought it for one of your friends yet, come on, go to book.ballenstudios.com or go to wherever books are sold and get a copy today. Again, that is book.ballenstudios.com or go to wherever books or audiobooks are sold to get your copy of our first book today. So that's going to do it. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, remember we have a whole slew of strange, dark, and mysterious shows. We have the Mr. Ballen podcast, Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Run Full, Bedtime Stories, and Wartime Stories. They are all excellent, they are all free, and available on all podcast platforms. All you have to do is just look up Ballen Studios wherever you like to listen to podcasts, and boom, you can find them all and start your binge. Thank you very much. Until next time, see ya. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here.